All right. Good afternoon, friends and comrades. Daniel Tutt here with Benjamin Studebaker. Second time he's appeared on Emancipations podcast. Benjamin, welcome back to the show. It's so nice to have you.
It's so nice to be back. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, Benjamin Studebaker is the author of 2 books on contemporary issues in politics. I want to invite you, Benjamin, just to give a snapshot of your research interests and your scholarly work for my audience, just to kick us off.
Yeah, so I have 2 monographs, The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, The Way is Shut, and Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies. Both of them focus very much on legitimacy, treating legitimacy also as ideology's other face. So ideology focusing on the sense in which the narratives that justify orders or states can be misleading, can be unhelpful, can be in various other ways bad. And then legitimacy focusing on the sense in which nonetheless these narratives might seem, or even genuinely from certain points of view, be justificatory, that there might be value in an order, which also from another point of view is decrepit. I kind of try to put together 2 big ideas in my work. One is the awfulness of the current political system, capitalism, the way that we live, the genuine deep dissatisfaction that this creates, but also the resilience of these institutions, the reasons why they nonetheless can continue to reproduce themselves, but also the forms of malaise that come from being committed to reproducing institutions that people don't feel very good about.
Very, very nice summary, Benjamin. It's so nice to have you back. The first conversation was on The Way is Shut, and I took a screen grab from The Lord of the Rings, which is where you get that subtitle from. Or is The Way is Shut actually the title of your first book?
It's the subtitle.
Subtitle.
I might have liked it to have been the title, but it's the subtitle.
It would have worked, yeah. Well, I was motivated to reach out because Benjamin had recently published a relatively short piece, which of course I'll link to in the chat, and I'm looking forward to comrades to weigh in on our conversation in the chat, and I'll also put it in the show notes in the YouTube description. The title of this piece, I think it's publicly available at bmstudebaker at substack.com, is called Political Despair and Moral Injunctions. So the argument that's going on here interested me, and it sparked a reflection about work that I have done in the Freudian thinker Philip Rieff. And I have spoken a bit about Philip Rieff on Derek Varen's show. I've published an article on Philip Rieff in Sublation magazine. And he's, of course, the author of 2 multiple books, but 2 very well-known books, one called Freud, the Mind of the Moralist, and the other one called The Triumph of the Therapeutic. And one of the things that Benjamin's article really stoked in me is this idea of a crisis of moral injunctions in our culture, in our society writ large, and of course in our politics. And for Rieff, the crisis of moral injunctions, Freud becomes a prophet of a sort of shift in our civilization to a new paradigm in which we experience a sort of collapse in the sacred, what he calls the sacred, as a general organizing principle in which we tether the shared and collective ideals that guide our civilization. Rieff seems to think that modern life is abandoning this model, and that Freud is actually a thinker who's urging us to return to this model. And he's a thinker who's sort of similar to Nietzsche, pointing out the sort of catastrophe of abandoning the possibility of a society built upon reaffirming commitment to moral injunctions, a society that sees itself as liberated through a particular conception of what Rieff calls psychological man. And psychological man is content with a form of existence in which political conflict is largely solvable through psychological therapeutic modalities managed by a kind of bureaucratic class. And Reef thinks, even though he's no socialist, even though he's no Marxist, he thinks that this constitutes a sort of disaster. And so he, is a very complicated American conservative thinker. Of course, I'm not necessarily convinced by his conclusions, but I'm very interested in his diagnosis of the problem. So, Benjamin, I wanted to start off with an understanding of what, first off, you mean by a crisis over moral injunctions. In your article, you seem to suggest that we're dealing with both a crisis of morals as well as a crisis of politics. And what I was very interested in actually was the moral injunction piece, because one of your arguments is that most forms of politics today end up forcing us into maybe a guilt situation, or maybe dealing with what Spinoza called negative affects. We feel shame, we feel despair, because we have a pressure to act politically. And so we act politically. But when we act politically, nothing results, or maybe something results, but it's not something that assuages that deeper kind of impetus to begin with. So we end up in this sort of situation of despair, which ultimately you're not necessarily opposed to despair, which is a whole other thing we'll get to. But maybe you could start by talking about the crisis of politics first, and then we'll maybe move to the moral component.
Yeah, so for me, politics is to do with intractable disagreement. You have some people who think of politics as about conflict, about fighting, war by other means, something you do with enemies, people you're hostile to, or you do to enemies, people you're hostile to. Uh, Other people think about politics as a kind of wonderful, deliberative, consensus-oriented thing where everybody comes together, acts in concert, sings Kumbaya, there's peace, love, and dope. Either of these ways of thinking about politics only captures, I think, a side of it. Politics involves intractable disagreements, but with people whom we're committed to nonetheless acting with. So when we get into a political level with people, we have a point of disagreement that we're not able to work through at the level of just having a conversation that eventually produces a consensus or an agreement. We also can't simply bargain. We can't make a trade. We can't have some kind of commercial resolution. Instead, the only way that we can act together is to act in the face of the disagreement. So to act in a way which some of the people who are participants are going to regard as not what they wanted, not in their interest, not in accordance with what they value. And then we have to nonetheless get those people to go along with what we're doing because they're still parties to the thing. So for instance, if I'm trying to pick a movie with my fiance, sometimes we want to watch quite different movies. And there's no way of me persuading her that the movie I want to watch is the one that we should watch. And there's no way of her persuading me that the movie she wants to watch is the one that I want to watch. Nonetheless, we're committed to the idea that tonight we're going to watch a movie. Therefore, we've got to pick a movie, even though whatever movie we pick, somebody's going to be a little bit bent out of shape about it. And we want to watch movies repeatedly over time. We're not just doing this once. We're going to watch lots of movies together over the course of our relationship. So therefore, we need a way of picking movies which produces a decision that can be sustained across time, that transgresses against sometimes mine, sometimes her conception of what movie we ought to watch at any given time. And this might involve creating certain mechanisms procedurally to manage the decision about the movie so that we regard the way that we pick the movie as fair. Many people, when they have this kind of problem with somebody in their life, they don't come to a political way of managing it. So for instance, we might flip a coin between her movie and my movie. Maybe she gives me 3 movies and I pick the one that I like best one week. And then the next week, I give her 3 movies and she picks the one of the 3 that she likes best. There are ways of managing the process so that everybody feels that they're part of the decision even when they don't get what they want, or such that everybody feels that the decision was well taken or well made, even though it wasn't at first blush what they're looking for. But what a lot of people do is they try to subject other people to moral pressure and go, come on, I really want to watch this movie. They maybe deceive themselves that they've produced a consensus over which movie to watch when really the other person is rolling over so as to avoid having to have a real discussion about it. In the kind of nebulous space of the moral, you get all of this pressure that doesn't fully rise to the level of the political, which doesn't acknowledge the intractability of the disagreement, and which tries to avoid it or insists that it can be overcome, that a consensus can be reached. If we just talk about which movie to watch long enough, you'll see that I'm right and that the movie that I want to watch tonight is the one that we ought to watch. And of course, the movie thing is a very superficial example. Most of the time when we're having a disagreement, it's about bigger stakes. And it's often outside of the family situation. In fact, stereotypically, it's to do with the state. But the political is in day-to-day life. It's there all the time. And as soon as you have a friend group, a partner, children, you are going to find cases in your life where there's intractable disagreement that cannot be simply resolved by going for consensus. And also, obviously, you can't just treat these people like enemies and just coerce them with violence. That wouldn't work. So politics is about not doing either of those things, neither having this moral injunction that's abstracted away from the reality of intractable disagreement, or the resort to pulling out a gun and using that to make the people in your life watch the movies that you want them to watch.
So the turn to the moral injunction, what is that a symptom of? As I opened describing Philip Reef's sort of framework, right? One of the things he would say is that there has been a shift to a kind of bureaucratic management that is concurrent to the rise of the welfare state. It's sort of a general argument about the post-World War II political economy and general social order. And he thinks that something is lost. And he thinks that the bureaucratic class is largely responsible for this crisis. And so what happens is that politics does become moralized, because that's the only horizon that the bureaucratic class permits the general working class, the masses, et cetera, et cetera. And he's talking primarily in the core Western regions, right? We could criticize perhaps the framework of his political economy as very rudimentary and basic, but he's a cultural theorist. But you see his point is that this is actually a structural condition of the system, right? And in fact, from the standpoint of bureaucratic management, it is preferred. It is preferred, and moreover, psychoanalysis is a kind of method that gives the bureaucratic class a strategy, a method by which they can convert intractable political differences into psychological remediation, basically. So, for example, if I can show that the basis of human aggression is reducible to the Oedipus complex or to another psychological complex that can be indexed to the psyche in this way, I have effectively shut down collective political struggle, and I have also shut down the horizon of truly contentious proletarian politics at the same time. So he obviously was deeply influential to a thinker like Christopher Lasch. And many have argued that psychological man, as Reef develops it, is what Lasch develops under the notion of the culture of narcissism. So what I wanted to ask you, Benjamin, is if you could sort of take a step out and talk about the structural preconditions to the perpetual problem here. Obviously, I think you're going to approach it through the prism of legitimacy, and that's great. But how do you think that structural dynamic that is somehow keeping the political in a kind of retreat or in abeyance or creating this crisis of the political?
Yeah, so there's a desire to get rid of the political. And getting rid of it often involves redescribing it or redefining it as something else. And these redescriptions or redefinitions of the political, I think, take kind of two different, seemingly opposite, but ultimately complementary forms. right? One is to identify the political with the search for consensus or the search for agreement. And the other is to identify the political with dangerous ideological violence. And sometimes you even have cases in which someone identifies the political with dangerous ideological violence, but likes that and wants that. And sometimes you'll have cases where people identify the political with conversations in the pursuit of consensus, and they won't like that. But
so
in both cases,
that latter would be Hannah Arendt and say Jürgen Habermas, right? The latter one. Right?
So yeah, they I think like the political as they conceptualize it, but it's a very deliberative conversational mode. It aims at coming to an agreement. It operates on the premise that agreement or consensus is possible, at least with a long enough time horizon, right? And then conversely, there are people who react to that with great frustration because it seems like real conflicts that do exist are being ignored or brushed off to one side. And so then you get conceptualizations of the political that are very violent in character, that are very based on fundamental contestation, friend enemy. But I'm kind of influenced a little bit by Roman ideas here. To me, there is a big difference between treating someone as an enemy, as a hostis, like a strange foreign object that is potentially threatening or menacing, and treating someone as a citizen, having civil relations with someone that you don't agree with. And what somebody like Schmidt does is reclassifies civil people we have a civil relationship with as enemies, as hostis, as if they were strange, which I think is a depoliticizing. But he calls it, this is what politics is for him. So what a lot of these guys do is they're uncomfortable with what politics potentially might mean or might do. It seems like politics is dangerous. And so there's an attempt to get rid of it. And this goes all the way back to Hobbes and Hobbes's conception of the corporate state. All right, what does Hobbes's state do? It gets rid of disagreements about what's good, what does God want. You just do whatever the king says so that there's peace. You don't have the disagreement rise to the level of there being a possibility of a serious confrontation. You, as soon as the king tells you, knock it off, this is a threat to order, you knock it off because it's a threat to order. So there's a kind of lexical priority on something else over and above the various things that are human values that people bring into politics, everything from their aesthetic tastes to their moral beliefs to their all human values can be politicized and brought into the political, epistemic values, et cetera, et cetera. So there's an attempt to keep these things from really driving what we do and to instead have a priority on the maintenance of order. And that priority on the maintenance of order gives, for Weber, a responsibility to the political actor to just stop it with the conviction once you reach a certain point. Just stop it. At a certain point, you have to recognize the primacy, always the primacy of order in this modern Hobbesian corporate state world that we have created. And so as a consequence of this, human values aren't able to go into the political terrain and are left stuck in the moral and stuck in the social. And there are consequences to the repression of the political.
Yes.
You get all of these morbid symptoms, these moral expressions, which are an attempt at the political, but cut off from actual politics. And you get subjects who don't have political skills, who aren't able to recognize or deal with intractable disagreements when they arise. So they pretend that disagreements don't exist, or if a disagreement does exist, they can't handle this. The person must be their enemy.
Yeah. So Philip Rieff argued that this modality that you're describing introduces a tool, an instrument that the bureaucratic class can use to assuage the inbuilt aggression of the masses. And this is what he termed anti-politics, right? So anti-politics becomes a kind of ruse or a sort of the creation of a sort of scene where citizens are effectively under the impression that their behavior is constituting political behavior, when actually it is, as I mentioned before, sort of ultimately the expression of these psychological mechanisms that the psychoanalyst or the bureaucrat, as so-called a new priest, can attend to these. And so politics therefore enters into both something ubiquitous, hyper, but in reality, at a material level, it's actually a kind of grand design of an anti-politics in some way. Now, you're saying something close to that. You're also saying that an effect of this condition is despair. So is despair a uniquely political affect for you? And can you talk about how it is generated in this situation?
So I make a distinction between political despair and spiritual despair. So spiritual despair involves despair about existence itself, the meaningfulness of existence. So that kind of despair is potentially something that can generate suicidality. A political despair is limited to the terrain of the political. So what it is it's a despair about being able to be political as a form of life. Of course, because politics is even there when you disagree with your partner about what movie to watch, it's not as if there will never be anything political in your life. The political comes up all the time when we deal with people in separate bodies who are different from us. But a life that is committed first and foremost to the political, a life that is guided by politics, becomes impossible in a society where the political is so heavily repressed. So this despair frees you from the injunction to be political. There's a demand all the time that you find a way to politicize your values. And in ordinary situations, in the past, if you lived in a time where politics and morality were not estranged in this way and not cut off from one another, in Athens or Rome or something, the values that you have, you straightforwardly politicize. And politics, of course, involves human values. There would be no straightforward separation of these things. And of course, the values that it's appropriate to have are to some degree conditioned by what can be legitimated. Part of how you figure out what it is morally that you value is by being in political dialogue with others and figuring out what can you in fact do with them. And conversely, doing politics is conditioned by the values that everybody brings into the political space. When you estrange the political and the moral and you cut them off, and I think you could see evidence of this, very early in Western thought, in Machiavelli, the estrangement of morality and politics, and you put them in opposition to each other, then you get to a stage where it becomes impossible to do politics and therefore impossible to politicize the values that you have. That doesn't mean that life becomes meaningless, but it means that there are certain kinds of activity that you can't really engage in. And if you try to engage in them, you won't actually be doing it. You'll be doing something which is a kind of palliative ersatz, which won't actually accomplish the aim of making the values that you have meaningfully political. So the injunction to do that, the demand from everybody in liberal democratic society that you be political and that you find a way to politicize these values, becomes meaningless once this is acknowledged. And so the despair frees you from this injunction to do something you can't do. And I think that real existential misery comes from having unrealistic expectations of ourselves, wanting ourselves to be or to do things that we can't be or do. So political despair, I think, militates against spiritual despair. Political despair can protect you from spiritual despair. Whereas for people who say there's no possibility of a meaningful human life without the political, who, if you can't be political, also become miserable in terms of affect, that's much more dangerous than at that point. That can lead people into terrorism, into political crime, into suicide, and into the various kinds of lifestyles associated with that. So we're living in a time where the moral and the political have become estranged. So your moral values don't have to become political, and therefore you don't have to become miserable that you're not able to do this.
You're advocating that not a retreat from the political, but you're advocating an acknowledgement that we must, even though you don't use this term, I think it's valid to sort of subtract from the existing political machinery while not abandoning or remaining bound to it at the same time. And this is something that you kind of conclude the piece with. And, I think that there's obviously been quite a lot of things written about the politics of asceticism, this is a huge debate in the history of Marxism. This is a big debate that we currently have on the Marxist and socialist left with the ultra left. I'm thinking of Tikkun and the Invisible Committee, these communization theorists who think that we should establish communes as a kind of, in some cases, in like Bruno Bostiel's or Joshua Clover's work, as a means for kind of staking down sovereignty and sort of creating a kind of alternative economy. You see this a lot in post-Marxism as well. We also see this on the right. Thinking here of Dreyer's the Benedict option, right? Which is, we retreat, right? As conservative Christians, we retreat from hegemonic liberalism into a type of ascetic politics. Now, clearly, I don't think you are advocating asceticism here. What is this embrace of the negative mood of political despair? And we'll get to the distinction between spiritual and political in a moment, because that's fascinating. And I want to actually funnel that through Sartre and Camus, because I actually would argue that absurdism for Camus, Camus is not totally an apolitical thinker. He's also thinking a certain impasse, a certain impotence of politics in his time, and absurdism emerges there, similar to your conception of despair. Anguish for the early Sartre, the pre-Marxist Sartre, being in nothingness, is also tethered to some political crisis, you see. So often theorists will create a whole conceptual apparatus that presupposes a certain fate of their existing political situation as impossible or as intractable, etc. But to be more precise, I'm wondering about this move of an embrace of despair, a subtraction from anti-politics, and maybe we can define that a little bit more. I think a historical analysis would be useful here, because obviously the New Left had the motto, as somebody says in the chat, that the personal is political. And I don't know how you think about the way that that motto, and we could probably identify a dozen others, right, has sort of aged, right? But it seems to me that that is sort of one of the interesting proposals that really hasn't aged well, and maybe we could say has sort of diffused into this type of crisis that we're talking about now, where we don't have the capacity to discern the political from the moral. So how do you subtract, embrace despair, but not become an ascetic?
Yeah, so one of the distinctions I make is between the negative mood and the enclavist mood. The enclavist mood being the mood where you attempt to get out of the political and to make a safe space for yourself outside of it. Now, when people do enclavism, there's often some repressed political motivation that contributes to their desire for it. So if you go and try to construct a family, it's in part because you anticipate that there will be political moments in family life. And there are. Family life involves a certain amount of the political. So if you can't get the political at the level of the state, maybe you can have it at the level of the family. Or if you can't get it at the level of the state, maybe you can have it in a church community, or you can have it in an online fandom where you discuss, I don't know, Lincoln Park, or you could have it in a futurist, a tech company setting. There is, of course, a certain amount of the political that goes on in all of these different spaces, because there are moments where in tech companies, people have intractable disagreements about what to do, and they have to resolve that. There are moments in fandoms where people have intractable disagreements about how the fandom should operate. The political comes up in all these spaces. So some people go into the enclavist zones so that they can have politics where they can have it, acknowledging and admitting on some level that they can't have it on a larger level beyond that zone. Of course,
Right.
then, if you're doing that, the zones that you have given up are necessarily going to condition what goes on in the enclaves. So the enclaves are not entirely safe. There is a certain degree to which capitalism and the state promote the idea that you can have more control or more autonomy in these zones. But this is in part one of the ways in which the state legitimates itself, is by claiming that it creates a robust private sphere in which you can engage in political activity in a way that's sanitized and safe and doesn't cause any sort of disruption to the system. Right? The negative mood is not enclavism.
Mm.
The negative mood involves staying with this reality that politics cannot be practiced on the level at which it needs to be practiced on in many domains, areas, zones of life in which it needs to be practiced. That the stories and narratives that people are telling you about why this is all fine and why we don't have to do politics, that these stories and narratives are ideological and not really true. There are more and more areas of life in which we have intractable disagreements, more all the time. There's more and more need for the political, more all the time. And the fact that we can't go there and that we can't do this causes us to not be able to take decisions or to not be able to legitimate the decisions that we take. And it means that more and more important decisions don't get taken and more stuff doesn't get done. And not just at the level of the state. This decay in political capacity ultimately infests the enclaves. So when people try to make decisions together in families or in churches or in fandoms or in tech companies, their inability increasingly to be political with each other forces both of these kinds of ways of avoiding politics that get misdefined as politics. So you get more cases in which there's hard coercion that's not really legitimated, and more cases in which you have, conversely, people denying that there's a disagreement, acting as if there's a consensus anyway, and acting shocked and appalled if you draw any attention to the fact that there isn't. Kind of as many anarchist spaces operate this way, where the power dynamics are disavowed, not acknowledged, brushed under the rug. So to stay in the negative mood is to continue to maintain your awareness of this and to continue to watch these spaces and try to understand them and try to see if there might be emergent at some point political potential, while acknowledging that just because you would like it, just because you're looking for it, doesn't mean it's there.
This is one of the symptoms of anti-politics, and I want to also introduce a new concept that I think was coined by Anton Jaeger of hyperpolitics, because I think that the two need to be thought dialectically. And let me try to do that and then get your response. I'll give you an example. So a lot of liberals today will look to the left, kind of the nascent post-Bernie socialist left, and they will be aggravated at us because we refuse to acknowledge that Trump stands as the monstrous centerpiece of the primary antagonism that the system must address. We refuse that gesture. And this then permits them to both throw up their hands and kind of do nothing while Trump continues to self-destruct, let's say. And for us, it becomes a question of like, well, there's a sort of weird inertia to what before was the liberals' hyperpolitics when Biden was in office, right? Everything was sort of this defensive operation centered around a hyperbolic or kind of misplaced treatment of Trumpism as the primary symptom. So how does anti-politics regress into hyperpolitics? Or maybe it goes the other way. I don't know. And because one of the things that I think a lot of us on the left struggle with in this despair is this precise issue, which is we have an account, as Jacques Rancière says, politics emerges through disagreement over what constitutes a wrong. And he uses a neologism of Rung, right, where it's like a word often that signifies something that is that point of intractability between two parties. And that then creates a sort of irreconcilable most of the time division between two political actors. We often face the liberals in saying, well, we don't really trust your account of what constitutes a contradiction, what constitutes an antagonism, and what the true source of the disarray of the social order really is about. And most of the time, this falls down to a total ignorance of questions of political economy. So how have you thought about this concept of anti-politics, how it might relate to hyper-politics? Do you find these categories or these concepts useful? And how might they relate?
Yeah, Anton, in hyperpolitics, the interesting thing about hyperpolitics is that Anton also says that the hyperpolitical activity doesn't actually seem to be meaningfully political. So there's a kind of aesthetic politicizing of things, but there's also a cutting off of perhaps what would be real meaningful politics. So we can take things that are associated with politics, like the parties or particular politicians, and we can gloss areas of life with associations with these things and say, if you are buying things or voting in ways that are associated with politics, that you're doing something bad or wrong, somebody political, wrong kind of political. What this, I think, does is it treats the political as an aesthetic and then injects it as an aesthetic into more and more and more spaces. And it comes from the fact that there isn't a meaningful politics available. So there's this desire, this reaching for something that's not there. And then you can't actually get the thing, but you can aesthetically politics wash all kinds of things that aren't really about making decisions on matters where there's intractable disagreement. In fact, usually what it's about is just demanding that the people in your life conform to what you think, which is not political at all. That's just making a moral argument without paying attention to the fact that there's a real disagreement there that isn't going to be dissolved by making an argument.
This is tricky because Carl Schmitt wrote an article once, maybe even a book. I read it as an article. It was on political romanticism. And Lukács has a very fascinating response to this article, which tore it to shreds. But part of what Schmitt was saying was that German idealism and the philosophical tradition of romanticism has aestheticized politics. The problem with that is that they have been unable to locate capacity for the cultivation of subjectivity, of political citizenship, in which decisive action is capable. And then from that, I think he will later derive in the concept of the political, this idea that decisiveness is preconditioned by the friend-enemy distinction. Now, you reject Schmitt's kind of ontological framing of the friend-enemy distinction as the overlay regarding kind of the cause of what rises to something properly political.
Because you have to be able to do politics with people you love and people that are your fellow citizens. You have to be able to do politics with your spouse. You have to be able to do politics in your day-to-day life whenever there's an intractable disagreement with somebody in another body. It's not something that you do on the basis of being enemies with people.
Right. And it also developed this concept in Schmitt of the partisan. And the partisan is a very problematic proposal, in my opinion, because it introduces something which is very third wayist. It sort of suggests that within any given political order, there's kind of like an antagonistic social class or social bloc that will be primed to being more readily eager to frame the friend-enemy distinction, will kind of have the courage to rise to that, right? And I think this is where Schmitt has had a great deal of influence on the right, frankly, through the conception of the partisan as this. Now, you can see how the left would also find it appealing, because you have, on the one hand, in Marx's conception of the proletariat, a debate about whether the proletariat is the empirical existing working class, wage laborers, versus other theorizations of proletariat as kind of, the most advanced in consciousness amongst the working class, i.e., as the partisan. I think the Schmittian incorporation on the left has been largely disastrous. I would argue that it has been. What I find very interesting, though, is most of the ways Schmittianism is expressed is through a kind of left Heidegger modality in which you have supplemented onto Schmidt's friend-enemy distinction the notion of the ontological difference, right? That politics is about something spiritually unlocking the political means that we will resolve the crisis of values, the crisis of morality, the crisis of politics, and transform. So you see, they have fused the spiritual with the political, which is not what you want to do. You don't want to. You don't want to do that.
Mistake. Yeah.
Why is that a mistake? Why is that a mistake?
To think that you can dissolve intractable disagreement, or that's likely to happen, that's just nuts. As long as we're people and we have different bodies, we are not going to be free from intractable disagreement. There's not going to be spontaneous consensus or even consensus on the basis of prolonged discussion. And even, Habermas and Arendt, insofar as they treat politics as something you can do through a prolonged discussion, have this kind of aim of getting rid of politics. And a lot of Marxists also have this aim of getting rid of politics, getting rid of the political. There's this desire to get rid of it.
Right.
And I think that, of course, if you define the political in terms of the Bonapartist state, you don't want the Bonapartist state. So there might seem to be a sense in which getting rid of the political would mean getting rid of that. But also lots of Marxists acknowledge that it's not as if getting rid of the Bonapartist state would end contradiction. And Adorno even describes at one point ideology as the promise to end contradiction. Ideology itself as being potentially that. So I think this idea that you can just get to a stage where everything operates by consensus and it's all real flush and you don't have to work through real meaningful disagreements with people, this is not a way of thinking about human beings.
I think that's interesting. I think what troubles me about this Schmittian Heideggerian philosophical turn, which was really influential in the early 80s in France with Jacques Derrida and left Heideggerians like Jean-Luc Nancy or Philippe Lecoux-Labart and others, which was, by the way, this work that they did was hugely influential on later left populism of Laclau and Mouffe. We should always remember that Laclau and Mouffe revised the conception of political totality as a kind of unfinished totality vis-a-vis Derrida and his work. And one of the things that they argue is that we should embrace the retreat, what they call the retreat of the political, meaning that no longer do the masses make history, in essence. No longer does large social totalities drive history, nation state politics, class struggle politics, Marxism, the age of ideologies where we could tether our ideology to a kind of universalist program. They say we should embrace the ending of that effectively. It's some variation on the Fukuyama's thesis, but perhaps pitched at a higher level of sophistication. And they call this then a post-foundational political ontology. And therefore, it's all based on this idea that society is in a state of crisis, but we should think about how to recompose justice, equality, values, etc. A is not necessarily tethered to a conception of the universal, but B as presupposing this fundamental contingency of social life. And I wanted to ask you what you think about this. This is a very postmodernist view. It's post-structuralist. And I've never asked you, Benjamin, what your thoughts on post-structuralism are. I don't know if you write about it too much. Could I ask you to respond to your thoughts on that, more maybe in general? And if you're not familiar as much with the French post-structuralists, you can feel free to reference other post-structuralists that you're more familiar with.
So I think that one of the things that went badly wrong in a lot of 20th century thought was this kind of false memory of medieval Catholicism as something which produced an overwhelming level of consensus, a kind of narrative about medieval Catholicism having provided this fixed, singular, unitary way of life, which doesn't really reflect what medieval Catholicism really was. There's a kind of fairy story about the church that is told so that you can say, oh, and then we got all of this disagreement. We have to find some way to bring everybody back together again. And the post-structuralists do this by saying we have to get everybody to commit to the idea that we won't be able to solve the disagreements. We have to get everyone to agree that we're not going to be able to do anything about disagreement. But politics is not doing anything about disagreement. Politics is managing disagreement. And managing disagreement means taking decisions that some people don't like and then legitimating those decisions to those people. So what post-structuralism does is it, again, tries to make a consensus. And in doing this, it falls into the same mistake that the people that the post-structuralists were criticizing were making, which is this wanting there to be a consensus, wanting there to be a unitary thing that you can get everybody to sign up to. Which is, it's not how the Middle Ages actually worked. And then, you know, in addition to not being historically accurate, you can't actually get people to have this level of consensus. It's not actually possible. And, you know, in many respects, this is a generative and interesting thing about people, that we disagree persistently, and then you have to work it out.
Very fascinating. And in a way, it seems as if their theory of the end of ideologies is not in concert with your conception of political ideologies. And I did want to ask you, I know that you recently taught at a teach-in, I believe at University of Virginia, on various theories of political ideology. And I was wondering, in this moment, which we are diagnosing here as this kind of, and I kind of want to be clear to people, I don't think that we are or that you in your piece and as we're discussing it are necessarily making a claim similar to what these French post-structuralists were claiming, that there is in fact an ontological retreat. They called it a retreat of the political. That's why I put a question mark in the title of our interview here. No, you're saying the political still permeates and sort of colors social life. It's rather that the existing institutions which are capable of mediating that reality have a dereliction on their duty, and this actually brings us back in a bit to Philip Reef, because I feel that maybe one thing you maybe share with him is that you do put the onus on institutions and on a particular class, perhaps, of bureaucratic managers, if, after all, politics is about the management of intractable differences. So,
yeah, I wouldn't say that I put the onus on a class of managers. I would say that our institutions aren't fit for purpose, but because changing the institutions would require political capacity, and we've decided that the exercise of political capacity is dangerous, we've become locked into institutions that aren't fit for purpose.
Got it. You talk a lot in your work about the idea of political capacities, and it's not necessarily a framework that I use frequently, but I've grown to understand it a lot better in reading your work. And in a way, it's interesting to me because it is connected to socialism and Marxism insofar as a working class oriented politics would have to prioritize the reality that the working class condition vis-a-vis its capacity for self-reproduction, social reproduction, for the conditions of its own social existence. In capitalism, we can structurally rely on the fact that those capacities will not be adequately met, and that this fact propels us to address that, which bourgeois institutions, we know with a good deal of certainty, will not adequately address. Can you say more about this inadequacy of the provisioning of adequate levels of capacity building in citizens, in political actors? How do you get at that exactly?
Yeah, so there's a number of different things for a political decision to happen that people have to be able to do, right? You've got to recognize that there's intractable disagreement. You have to be able to see it for what it is and not reclassify it as an enemy relationship or as a consensus that is yet to be constructed. So it's got to be recognized that this is an intractable situation. Nonetheless, you have to take a decision. So you have to recognize the necessity of decision, the fact that you can't not take a decision indefinitely, that will have costs, and not just for you, but also potentially for the person you're disagreeing with. They will also be harmed by the lack of a decision, right? So you need a decision. So you've got to be able to take a decision, despite the fact that you've not produced a consensus, acknowledging that you've not done that. And despite the fact that the person is not your enemy, acknowledging that they're not your enemy. So you're doing something to somebody who's not your enemy, and therefore you owe them an explanation for what you're doing. And you have to legitimate your action to them. And you might not get them to fully sign up, even on the basis of your legitimation. Nonetheless, it's your obligation as the one making the decision to try and to at least get across that you considered them, their point of view, their interests as part of this. So there's all of these different things you got to do in terms of recognizing the situation, taking a decision, explaining, legitimating the decision, right? And then also people have to be able to deal with being subjects to decisions. They have to be able to deal with the fact that sometimes they will not get what they want. So what happens when people try to do ostensibly political organizing is that all of these different capacities don't actually come off. People deny that there is an intractable disagreement, so they misrecognize it and pretend it's something else. If they see the intractable disagreement, they're not willing to make a decision, or if they do make a decision, they insist on framing the person that is subject to the decision as an enemy who deserves to be coerced, so that they don't have to deal with what they're actually doing, which is coercing a civil friend, right? And then, in addition to all of that, there is a difficulty legitimating the decision. And because there's a difficulty legitimating, the people who are not convinced by the act don't tend to cooperate. So if you need them to participate for the act to come off, they don't participate, they quit, they leave, they don't actually follow the decision, they leave the organization, right? And sometimes they not only don't participate, they potentially plot against you in response to what you've done and take your power to decide away because they won't be subject to your decision. They won't be subject to it perhaps because you can't legitimate it to them, perhaps because they're unwilling to accept not being the ones who made the decisions, or the decisions not being taken on the basis of consensus. In all of these different and many ways, almost every organization of the left continuously fails to be political or to even approach the political meaningfully. And when the political is raised, it's usually in a confused way, referring to a conception of politics that has nothing really to do with any of what I'm describing.
It seems to me that there's a couple of things. There's structural impediments to existing institutions which frustrate this capacity. And therefore, perhaps, as Andrew was mentioning in the chat, I think an interesting point. He said, well, this question of adequacy of political citizenship is non-dialectical. It's a very interesting point because I think in the history of socialism and Marxism, of course, there does emerge in the sequence of political activity the necessity to expropriate the expropriators, right? There is a foundational commitment to the deployment of tactics, some of which will be within the parliamentary system and many of which will not be. And therefore, there is really, in the tradition of revolutionary socialism, of course, the necessity to break the law. You are offering an analysis that is very fascinating. I'm wondering how, specifically for Marxist organizations, for which we recognize this plurality of tactics and strategies, some of which will be within normative institutions of the ruling order, housed within bourgeois institutions. There's various strategies. There's, for example, the Trotskyist idea of the transitional demand, where you make demands on bourgeois systems to effectively cripple them, knowing full well that they can't meet those demands, right? There's a lot of hysterical ways that people still do that, but there used to be, and I think there is a historical record of transitional demands actually, perhaps being quite successfully done. That's presupposed on you having a certain level of power within the bourgeois system, which we don't have. So I'm wondering if this model can have the kind of flexibility to think these various forms of tactics, and whether you yourself would be open to tactics that would include non-democratic actions, right? Whether that be, I'll leave it at that. Does that make sense? And
Yeah,
how
the
do
way
you?
I'm thinking here doesn't presuppose certain
Yeah.
normative views about what kinds of decisions are or aren't acceptable. So you might have to make a decision which might involve the deployment of force. That's one of the things that you might do. But when you're doing that, even if you're subjecting people to force, you're not subjecting them to force on the basis that they are enemies necessarily.
I see.
You're subjecting them to force on the basis that there doesn't seem to be any other way of moving forward to advance some important objective except by this means, or that this seems to be a much better or more effective strategy or tactic or way of moving forward than the other stuff that's available. And you have to give those reasons. You have to explain it. You have to legitimate it. Otherwise, people will say, well, why are you using that kind of force in this situation? We're not sure we agree with that kind of force. We don't like that we're potentially being subject to this force. You've got to get people to cooperate. If you tell people, go out into the streets and disperse some crowd of people with guns, go and beat people with sticks until they leave a space. You have to convince those people to actually go and do that thing. So you have to have some account of why it's necessary to do this. And people have to be persuaded by that account, or at least persuaded well enough to not get in the way. It might not be that you need everybody to actively participate, but you need other people to at least tolerate it, put up with it. Because if you give an order and no one obeys it, then you're not going to be able to sustain whatever position you're in on the basis of which you thought you could make decisions. Right? If the president orders the military to shoot everybody in the Congress, that order will not be successful because the president will not be able to legitimate that order. Nonetheless, you could imagine some strange hypothetical situation in which it might not be that way, in which the president might actually be able to convince the military to shoot everybody in the Congress. The question is, can that be legitimated in that circumstance? And that's very circumstantial and context dependent. So this is this theory can operate in lots of different contexts. And I'm not preloading it with a bunch of normative stuff about how to use it, where, when to do this or that. What I am saying is that politics is not something that you do to enemies. Once you have decided that somebody is not part of politics with you, once you've decided that you're going to treat somebody as a enemy in a war, you're not doing politics with them anymore. You've crossed into a different kind of terrain. You've excluded them from the political. You've excluded them from citizenship. And this is something that Hobbes makes very clear. If the state puts you in danger, you're not subject to that state. You're not a citizen of a state that attacks you. So when you go into, once you decide to use that kind of force, you've decided to expel people. And this, we talk about a purge, an expulsion of people. This is not doing politics with them. This is a decision to expel people from the political because you've decided that you can't do politics with them. It's a concession and admission that politics can't be done with them. It's not the political, it's a failure of the political in that sense.
I'm thinking of two things. First off, which is in the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels write that as proletarian politics gains more general recognition and success in the society, members of the ruling class begin to face a decision as to whether they're going to side with the working class movement or not. And so there's left open, therefore, a non-vulgar conception of the enemy as tethered to the social being of their class position, right? That's fundamentally left open because it's a field of struggle, which is forever moving, right? And of course, in a history of revolutions, socialistic revolutions, that's exactly what we've seen. Defectors from the ruling class join the other side, as it were. At the same time, the other thing I'm thinking about, as hearing you elaborate this point, is the context of the sort of morally saturated dynamics that we faced on today's left, and this idea of purging. And I'm wondering if you could reflect upon this notion of purging. And I'm not going to, I think there's a lot of ways that we talk about cancel culture that feed into a kind of victimology, a victim fetish that itself is a reflection of the sort of worst parts of our nature. And I'm not even going to go down that road. But maybe we could give a kind of a more rational account, perhaps, of this purging tendency and fit it back into your article.
Yeah.
How does that work?
There's a brittleness to an institution that has to engage in a purge, right? If you have to purge people, it's because you can't legitimate decisions to them. So you have to kick them out of the audience for legitimation. You have to exclude them in some way. So for instance, in Bernard Williams' book, In the Beginning Was the Deed, he talks about the helots in Sparta as this class that is excluded from the audience for legitimation. So there's no effort to explain Spartan politics to the helots. The decisions that the helots are subject to, no one explains them. Nobody thinks that the helots are parties to the decision. They're not fellow citizens. There's no civil relation between a citizen of Sparta and a helot. So the helots are excluded on that basis from the citizen body. They don't enjoy any kind of civil relation. When you do that, it's in part because you don't think that you could incorporate those people and do politics with them. Your institution isn't able to bear the level of intractable disagreement that would involve. Because, of course, if the helots all had Spartan citizenship, and Spartan citizenship meant Spartan citizenship, if you didn't change what Spartan citizenship meant to make it meaningless or worthless, then they would completely contest the entire structure of Sparta. And it would be impossible to go on having Sparta with them as citizens there. So once you do a purge, it's an acknowledgement of a kind of difficult situation in which it's not possible to legitimate what you're doing to an audience of the size that you've previously had. So you are making the thing smaller. You're reducing the size of the civil body to try to get something that is able to act and is still functional in terms of being able to make decisions.
So I'm going to give you a little case study and see what you think about it. I think recently the DSA put forward a motion to ban members of J Street, the progressive, I guess they are Zionist, technically, Jewish organization, because of their positions on the Gaza genocide. And I am frankly very sympathetic to that motion that DSA did, because I think that the asymmetry of dominant institutions, from the university to civil society groups to political organizations, is such that we lack the leverage and the means to leverage shifts amongst that constituency of people. And that shift in political moral commitment to the genocide in Gaza, to acknowledge it internal to their institutions, I see as of urgent priority, of the utmost order. So therefore, I support it. Now, that does kind of contradict what you were just saying, right? And I'm wondering how you might respond to such a decision on behalf of, DSA in this instance.
Well, so I'm not convinced that DSA is a properly political organization. I would conceptualize DSA as an enclavist organization that has a political aesthetic that veils what it actually is and what it actually does from the people who are in the organization.
I unfortunately have a similar conclusion, which is why I've never myself joined. I joined a group called Class Unity, which broke off from DSA. Um, they then presented other unique limitations, which we're not going to talk about, but I do share that view based upon my analysis of its historical foundation out of the ideology of Harrington, Michael Harrington. And we were just meeting with comrades last night from DSA as part of Marxist Unity Group for drinks here in Washington, D.C. And, you know, they're obviously much more optimistic because their position as well. There are democratic mechanisms internal to DSA which allow for DSA to be a class struggle organization, which effectively could result in conventions effectively moving strongly against the consensus of the professional managerial class that otherwise runs the DSA. You see the point? So that they still maintain a fidelity to the fact that DSA can effectively be the expression of the American working class internal to its own procedural mechanisms, that there's a kind of degree of openness there, right? And you seem to reject that. I'm wondering if you might say more about that.
Yeah, so in Legitimacy and Liberal Democracies, in addition to the negative mood and the enclavist mood, I have two other moods that people can be in, the conservative mood and the liberal mood. And these moods involve a lack of recognition of the degree to which politics has become impossible, a belief that you can still get the existing institutions to function on the basis of legitimation stories, abstractions, values that are relatively common in our society. So the conservative mood focuses on values that have been around for a while. So it might be abstractions that are older, you know, peace, prosperity, order, or it also might be ways of conceptualizing liberal legitimating abstractions that are more old-fashioned, you know, thinking about liberty primarily in terms of not being, you know, bound in chains, or thinking about it in terms of non-interference in some sort of Isaiah Berlin sense, or equality in the sense of equality before the law, you know, very limited, very older kinds of legitimation stories to do with those abstractions. And then the liberal mood is the mood where you want to reinvent those abstractions, to make them more demanding, to make them point beyond where we presently are. And you think that you can press the existing institutions on the basis of the abstractions that they're committed to. So if the state, if democracy says, you know, this is a state that's committed to freedom, it's committed to equality, it's committed to representation, you show that actually, if you were to conceptualize freedom, equality, and representation in the appropriate, demanding way, that the state's behavior falls short of the abstractions to which it's committed, and then you press the state on the basis of this. Habermas recommends something like this in the legitimation crisis from the mid-70s, right? So a lot of people are still in this liberal mood. They think that they can kind of press the Democratic Party, or they can press the American state on the basis of liberal abstractions that they think these entities are committed to. And they think that they can produce a consensus among a large group of people that there's a gap between the way liberty or equality ought to be understood and the way that these organizations or entities take these terms up. I think that this is not realistic. It is grounded on a level of consensus surrounding liberal ideals that is not actually achievable, even narrowly within the left, much less within a broader part of society. And so in practice, this doesn't really work. And so it doesn't really go where it theoretically is intended to go. Nevertheless, there are a lot of people who think they're doing politics on something like that basis and join organizations like the Democratic Party or the DSA, thinking that in participating in those organizations, they're going to be able to do politics, that there will be a becoming political to that. I think that that's just a mistake, and it's grounded on the same fundamental error that I pointed out earlier, which is a lot of people think that they're going to be able to produce agreement on all kinds of wild and wacky stuff that there is no sign there's going to be any kind of widespread agreement on these things. Getting people to think that there's a particular image of freedom, the state is not in alignment with it, and therefore the state has to be pressed by people to conform to this abstraction. This is not how our politics is actually going to work. But lots of people still think this way.
Yeah. So you invoke this notion of a political mood, and one of the things we haven't probed is your theory of political affects, right? Now, as I mentioned and hinted at before, I think that Spinoza has a lot of very interesting points about how to overcome negative political affects, and he writes a lot about the way that negative political affects override our sense of rationality, and that they ultimately, so you could say, almost like collapse the possibility of political communication. I think, though, however, and this is one area where I think psychoanalysis has a lot to offer, frankly, especially this debate that Lacan gets into with Heidegger about the ontological foundation of anxiety, whether anxiety possesses an object or whether it fundamentally does not possess an object. Alain Badiou will theorize, for example, that in every revolutionary movement, the social order is sort of overwrought with political anxiety, and this is the sign of something that is sort of being birthed, being brought into existence that formerly didn't have a proper political existence. So my point is that what I like about your piece is that you're sort of saying something like that for political despair. So one is, say more about despair as an affect. And I love the, literature in virtue ethics, right, that links affects to virtues, right? And there's a way in which maybe affects have a dialectical relationship to the virtues. Obviously, despair is a negative affect as much as it is a negative virtue. Although the embracing of it, and here I'm even thinking of Gramsci's what is it? Optimism of the intellect, pessimism of the will, or maybe it's the reverse. And I would wonder how you would place your optimism, pessimism, or whether those are even relevant categories for you. But maybe first you could articulate more about what is first off a political affect for you. And I don't know how much you read psychoanalysis and Freud, or whether that literature has shaped your views on political affects or not. But what would you say to that?
So the moods that I frame in legitimacy and liberal democracies are all moods that have to do with how people relate to legitimation. So how they want decisions explained to them, and what kinds of explanations are likely to be persuasive. So someone in the conservative mood will have either traditional abstractions that you could invoke in antiquity or the Middle Ages as their central points of reference, or they'll have liberal abstractions, but conceptualized in an older kind of way, older, less demanding sort of way, such that you could suggest that in the 19th century, plausibly, these abstractions were being lived up to. And then the liberal mood, which involves trying to point these things more radically beyond where they're presently at to make them more demanding. So therefore, more ambitious stories, often involving the same liberal abstractions, but more ambitious in content, more demanding in content. The negative mood being the mood where you have become unconvinced by both conservative and liberal stories. So you're not being motivated by explanations involving any of that because you see a falseness to it. And then the enclavist mood, which people often go in to get out of the negative mood, although that's not the only way to end up there, where you are focused more on mediation. So the state can't deliver on abstractions directly for you because you are not satisfied with direct narratives coming from the state about its acts to you. But the state creates a sphere and justifies itself to you on the basis of the creation and maintenance of the sphere. And that can be the corporation, the family, the church, the religious organization. So in this way, the state avoids having to deal with your discontent because when you feel it, you take it into one of the spheres. and you make your demands, make your demand for legitimation, demand for explanation to people in those spaces. So you go, Dad, why are you treating me this way? Or you go after your priest. You say, I'm not sure about the way that you're leading the congregation. You go after the moderator in your fandom forum, or you go after Elon Musk, and you say you're ruining my feelings about my Tesla with your talking. There's a mediation that occurs that keeps it from being in dialogue with the state and with its activity directly. A lot of psychoanalytic discussions, I think, are kind of sub-political, because a lot of psychoanalytic discussions presume subjects that are not able to operate at the level of entertaining whether a decision is or isn't legitimate. So a lot of psychoanalytic discussions focus on people who are very badly underdeveloped because they weren't raised in a functional family environment.
Well, I think that's interesting because Freud's neurotic subject, he often makes a comparison between the rebel and the artist and the scientist. And there's a way to read Freud's neurotic as a kind of revolutionary subject. And you see this in a lot of Freudian Marxism. This, I think, leads to a problem slightly different to what you are saying, which is that a lot of Freudian Marxism, therefore, perceives revolutionary agitation from the position of either the neurotic or the hysteric, right? So the projection of a refusal of normativity. I mean, the origin of psychoanalysis was the study of female hysterics. There's been a great deal written about the historical conditions that brought about this very unique illness, because it was psychosomatic. It was appearing in the body, and Freud's talking cure was capable of alleviating that symptom in the body. Through speech, through an analysis of speech, they could regain their autonomy. So back to Philip Reeve, Philip Reeve says, yeah, Freud recognizes the new neurotic illness of civilization, but his cure is meant to normalize the status quo. And this is why he says Freud was opposed to Bolshevism. He was opposed to socialism. This is why he gives an art of living for the bourgeoisie. And he says that everyone that completes psychoanalysis ultimately gets kind of, comfortably readjusted to bourgeois social order. Now, that's a very different argument than Freudian Marxists. Let me be clear. So there's a sort of variety. There's a wide variety. I don't know that psychoanalysis actually, at least from the clinic, today's clinic, puts a big onus on subjects of unique inequality. I think, on the contrary, psychoanalysis, unfortunately, still largely remains a middle-class practice. And that, in fact, people who have experienced material setbacks, right, as you mentioned, they don't have the insurance. Insurance doesn't cover psychoanalysis. So they, one of the things I think it would be better, actually, if psychoanalysis was more engaged with those subjectivities, marked by inequality. So
just
I
to
would
clarify, I wasn't talking about people who are materially poor. I was talking about people who lack political capacity, so sub-political, people who have a kind of inability to deal straight up with an explanation that comes from a source of authority because they have some kind of issue with authority.
Yeah, this goes back to the neurotic and the hysteric. Yep.
Right.
Yep.
So if you have some kind of issue with authority, then when a legitimation story is given to you from an authority, instead of thinking about that story in terms of your own value set and whether you find it persuasive, don't find it persuasive, instead of looking in a kind of rational way at the stories that are told to you and whether they seem to line up with the things that you actually care about, whether you're actually getting what you want out of the systems that you participate in. If you instead have some kind of preoccupation with the notion of authority as such, then this preoccupation with the notion of authority is going to cause you to be focused on the fact that somebody is legitimating a decision to you rather than the content of the legitimation story. And so I think there's a kind of immaturity, the kind of fuck you dad energy to a lot of people who are focused on the fact that somebody is taking a decision, the fact that, and this is where I was talking about people who aren't able to deal with the fact that there is intractable disagreement in the first place, or who aren't able to deal with the fact that people aren't listening to them and they're not the ones who are in charge. There's a kind of way of dealing with this stuff that's sub-political, that involves kind of a resistance to coming to terms with the reality of the political and the fact that we've got to work through these things.
Mm-hmm.
And I think often some sort of issue with authority plays a major role in this. So one of the things that a lot of psychoanalytic theory tends to do, although it doesn't necessarily have to do this, is to reframe real political conflict as something coming out of sub-political issues in the family, issues with the way people were brought up, issues with how people have or haven't adjusted to social norms or mores, levels of development relative to the age that somebody is. There might be a real issue with the actual substance of the legitimation stories that are being told versus what's actually taking place versus what particular people actually care about. That's veiled if you suggest that the people who cause political trouble are causing it because they have a problem with authority as such, as opposed to having a problem with the specific things that are being done and the specific explanations that are being given. You can be someone who would be perfectly content to be the subject of a decision that's appropriately legitimated to you, and yet nonetheless object to a particular decision on the basis that it doesn't actually correspond with your values, your needs, your interests, your way of understanding what it is, how decisions should be taken, what kinds of procedures are fair or grounded in an appropriate epistemology. There's all sorts of perfectly reasonable reasons for rejecting a decision without becoming somebody who has some sort of weird issue with authority. But there's a tendency in the psychoanalytic community to sort of universalize these issues with authority and to kind of plaster them on everybody, and then use this to derationalize a lot of the otherwise quite, I think, meaningful and interesting objections people have, by instead trying to reframe them as people who just have an issue with their dad, or have an issue with God, or have an issue with social mores.
Yeah.
It kind of debases something I think that's very human about people, which is to really genuinely disagree for good reasons about lots of things.
Mm-hmm. No, I think this is fascinating. I suppose there's levels to this, right? Because Freudian Marxism will also take it much further and try to sort of supplant or sort of superimpose the Freudian system of the subject of the unconscious at the level of understanding political processes as we have the capacity to sort of discern transformations in the libidinal investment of collective groups, right? So we kind of move from the claim that we can psychologically account for aggression, and we can kind of remediate it, into we can now account for revolution. We can now account for social change through this prism. And, Philip Rieff said that Marx was adamantly opposed to what he called psychological man. And of course, Nietzsche was, by his own admission, something like a kind of new psychologist. And Rieff makes an interesting point, is that Nietzsche was ultimately in favor of this modality. But the political rationale by which Nietzsche and Freud were interested in this total theory of psychology, let's call it that could superimpose an account of the political, could subsume it. Philip Rieff was suggesting in Triumph of the Therapeutic that, well, left-wing Freudians like Wilhelm Reich were effectively implementing Freud's insights by tearing down things like the bourgeois family itself. So he said the error of Wilhelm Reich was to actually go into the family and say, no, root and branch, these authority structures need to be abolished. And moreover, socialism will abolish them, right? And I have, written my first book kind of critical of that move, right? I don't want to get into the history of family abolition, but I think there's I guess, for listeners, there's sort of variety there's a whole spectrum of psychoanalytic takes, and I take your criticism very well. I want to move back to political affect, though, and ask you if you have a theory of the interrelationality between political affects. Have you thought about the way that political affects might correspond? In other words, how do we move out of despair? You're asking us to embrace it, and I see the logic, and you explained it well. But what comes after?
Yeah. So there's a piece I wrote for the Journal of Medical Humanities, by the way, that includes kind of paths to despair. And I also incorporate some material from that in Legitimacy and Liberal Democracies. I have the 5 A's, alienation, anomie, atomization, absurdity, and there's one more. Anxiety, yes. Kind of 5 different ways in which people become deeply dissatisfied with life and that can produce this kind of movement to despair. Absurdity in particular being one that people typically end up in, because it's this sense of that everything is out of tune, that nothing is responsive to your values or anything that you care about. That's how I conceptualize the absurd, a kind of confrontation with something which doesn't make sense at the level of what you care about. It seems indifferent to everything that matters to you. And to be in a system where it seems the system is indifferent to you, and yet nonetheless you're expected to be persuaded by legitimation stories, is very absurd. There is this absurd feeling that you are invited to participate in something that you feel completely estranged from. The issue is that it's very difficult for people to stay in the despair because of the tendency for people to, especially very political people, what I call in my first book, to do a play on Weber, the politically musical person, to avoid negative affect while being in the negative mood. So to be in political despair without allowing this to contaminate every other area of life. If people become too miserable, and Adorno sometimes talks about Marxism as something which tends to make people unhappy and is therefore difficult for people to be in as a framework for a long period of time. If you're unable to spiritually sustain yourself in a mood, then there's going to be a need to leave that mood so as to protect yourself, so as to get into a frame of mind that is more functional from the point of view of managing day-to-day life. And so in particular, I think the enclavist mood is a very common option to say, okay, I can't stay in the negative mood. I've got to do something with my life, get other projects that seem meaningful, that have something of the political in them, and then kind of veil to yourself a little bit the degree to which you're not really living politically. And get yourself kind of playing a bunch of games, sort of like the Hindu idea of God, to deliberately entertain yourself with games on some level until you forget that you're doing that. In the same way, people can come back to the conservative or liberal mood, but in a kind of post-despair way. So they can come back having already seen through the legitimation stories. They can nonetheless tell themselves in a kind of Kierkegaardian way that they must nonetheless believe to avoid becoming miserable. And this produces, I think, ironism and pragmatism in particular. These are the symptoms of a kind of post-negative return to the conservative or liberal moods. And I think that the issue is that this kind of motivation changes the subject. A subject that is in the conservative or liberal mood for post-despair, ironist or pragmatist reasons isn't committed in the same way to those values, those abstractions, as someone who has not gone through that. And therefore, the degree to which they can really act on the basis of those stories and abstractions is greatly restricted relative to what they might have done before going through that process. So you get people who are superficially in language committed to different legitimation stories, but would not in practice make the sacrifices that someone might have made in the past, or that other people in the same society who have not gone through that particular cognitive process, that other people might make. And so what you get is a kind of very unpolitical commitment that's skin deep, that's really a kind of psychological palliative. So it turns what seems to be politics into a way of protecting the spirit. So I'm very interested in ways of trying to stay in the negative mood for a long time, because I think if we were to be able to come up with anything else to do that would be meaningful, that might actually lead in the direction of politics, we would have to be able to stay in the negative mood and not rush to find politics before we've actually found a way of doing it. And that's the question. Can we distinguish the spiritual despair, the existential kind of attitude, from political despair, and stay in political despair without leakage?
Yeah. I want to, at the origin of Western Marxism, with Ernst Bloch and Lukács and then Benjamin, you have what we know as political messianism. And, you know, these are thinkers that were classically trained in, you know, the great classical sort of European tradition. They were largely formed off of a kind of existentialism, a type of political romanticism, not necessarily a liberalism, but, you know, they were all hugely affected by neo-Kantianism and the Max Weber circle. And then 1917 happens, and they both refer to becoming communists as undergoing a conversion. And they weren't afraid to use that kind of pseudo-religious language. Friedrich Engels and Anti-Düring criticized many of his sort of comrades on the left as agnostics, as not being political actors that are capable of fully believing in their activity. And therefore, they were kind of irresolute, right? What I think is implicit in both of those examples is a kind of conflation of the spiritual with the political. And I'll be honest, I mean, even though this might be a point of disagreement between us, because I'm not sure if I'm really opposed to that conflation. I think it has to be done well, and we got to think through it. But there is this question, and perhaps this is a 19th century question that you may judge is no longer relevant for us, of the overcoming of religious paradigms in the act of revolutionary socialism itself, as embedded in the tradition of revolutionary socialism. So therefore, it would make sense to think of, I mean, you know, before the early Marx and Engels wrote a lot about this idea of the kind of preconditions of converting to communism, let's put it that way. So we have this tradition. And then, you know, more recent scholars like Agamben and Badiou have written about how St. Paul provides the foundation of socialist universalism, communist universalism. It's founded in religion. So I want to go back to this division you're proposing between the spiritual and the political. What would you say to someone like me who's not as, I don't see it as problematic perhaps as you do? What would you say to that?
So I think the spiritual could be political in a case where we could bear intractable disagreement about spiritual matters. It's the attempt to create a consensus around a particular tradition that makes the spiritual not compatible with the political.
So, but what about the idea of the sublation of the spiritual into the political commitment? That the political commitment also entails the sublation of effectively secular or bourgeois forms of spiritual investment, that they become unified?
So I think that there are times in which you can, especially with certain old classical political theorists, you can see the political operating in direct dialogue with other things, and these things working together. For them to work together, there has to be not just a politics which is motivated by people's fundamental values, but also fundamental values which are in part motivated by politics,
right?
By the need to be able to act with people. So the political and the spiritual have to dialogue in a way that's mutualist. The tendency is to want to make the politics do what the spiritual wants, or to make the spiritual do what the politics wants. And when you do that, you get to a stage where there's a split. A split exists, and then that split tends to become very difficult to reconcile. And of course, people want reconciliation because a way of living in which you could make decisions together with other people in a way which would involve your most fundamental values would have to necessitate some bringing together of the spiritual and the political.
Right.
But if this is not possible because of the way in which our society has been transformed in modernity, insisting upon it will produce something regressed and barbaric that won't actually live up to the thing. So the attempt to make the political and the spiritual come back together prematurely without having done that work, this is another way in which people kind of dodge out of the negative mood. And one of the enclaves is the faith enclave, which is a way of trying to do religion in response to the inability to do politics. And conversely, there can be attempts to make religious values transform or dissipate. But if you do this in a context where you haven't set up the preconditions for it, it's not going to work. I think if you were to construct the kind of world in which real politics was possible, this would change the way religions look.
Yes.
Quite seriously, because right now religions are very cut off from the political, even insofar as they try to be political. It's in this very broken way because it's thought of as one thing trying to intervene in another thing. The thing is not conditioned by that which it intervenes in. And insofar as it does become conditioned, it seems to be destroyed by this conditioning. It doesn't seem to be able to operate in a harmonious way with the thing that it's trying to synergize with. So these are the kinds of obstacles I think that exist to this. I understand the attraction in principle to it. And I think it's something that, if you were to work through how might we get around to something where religion is transformed by the political, there would be a possibility of interesting things happening there. But until we have a real opportunity for the political, the rushing to do this will produce something barbarized.
I think that's brilliant. I also think there's a degree of inevitability regarding one's investment in a political program as necessarily incorporating how one has been trained in their own familial historical past to be a religious believer, right? It's very difficult to, right? I mean, you see this with folks raised in evangelical homes. There's a tendency that when they do move from a political worldview to another and they adopt a new one, it brings with it a kind of libidinal charge and intensity and so on. And a lot of that intensity can be very appealing. Can be very appealing, especially to certain subgroups that are longing for that passion, right? And sometimes, Marxism can kind of suck away some of that passion. That's maybe why I want the spiritual to be allowed in, because the maintenance of that passion I see as extra important, especially because we have to tether with the despair. So you need it as a supplement, right? At least I would assume, I would think.
You need it in life. You certainly need the spiritual in life. There's the way that you are able to be in the political despair is to have a robust spirituality of some kind. Some sort of serious convictions about what matters in life that you take seriously. So just because you can't pursue your values in some particular arena doesn't mean that they don't exist or aren't relevant to you anymore. There has to be some taking serious of your values, and to be able to assess the legitimation stories you're being told and to be able to judge them to be not really adequate. You have to be able to judge them from a position of some kind of spiritual strength. You have to have reached just a level of psychological development such that you can engage in this kind of activity without getting caught on the fact that we're talking about authority or we're talking about someone making a decision. So there has to be a level of spiritual development, I think, to be able to interface with my theory in a way that is relevantly healthy. And then people who are not able to do all of that because they haven't reached that level of spiritual development tend to respond by either going into the enclavist mood or coming back to the conservative or liberal moods in that ironist, pragmatist kind of way.
I think
I would take that to be symptoms of that.
I think that's smart. I think the history of continental left-wing philosophers, Zizek, Badiou, and Agamben, flirting with radical Christianity, had an error embedded in it, which was that internal to Christianity is a repertoire of latent emancipatory content and concepts that can be appropriated from within the tradition. I think what you're talking about is that actually, no, that's not necessarily the case, but there's an interaction that needs to occur mediated through institutions that would gradually over time, as the political force strengthens its presence in the world, would have an effect on. But you can't, it's undialectical to think that that would emerge internal to the religion. And I think that they were sort of maybe suggesting that, or many people concluded from that, maybe as a coping mechanism. I wanted to ask a final question about your own commitment to the socialist tradition. People in the chat are just curious. You can share as much as you wish to divulge about that. Obviously, you're very engaged with a number and a variety of socialist efforts on today's left, not just one. I think you seem to have a fundamental independence, which I admire. And you also approach these things with a kind of surgical precision, such that one of the great roles that you play on the left today is you help people think through problems, and you really get deep into that. And I think kudos to you on that. So we're going to ask you that selfish question. What is Benjamin Studebaker's socialism? If you would indulge us, and I apologize for the personal question if you perceive it that way.
Well, I think that socialism and indeed Marxism have a continuing relevance because there's an enormous amount of wealth, power, and also opportunity for intellectual, artistic endeavor generated in modernity. But the people who generate these things very rarely, and only in fleeting and incomplete ways, exercise any of this. They very rarely enjoy or get the benefit of any of it. And even those who do, it's often in a broken, sad, alienating, and isolating way. And there has to be retained, I think, a horizon of possibility that this might be overcome, that it might really be possible for much larger portions of the population than was heretofore imagined to gain a level of spiritual capacity necessary to be able to act well, to be able to dispose of significant amounts of wealth, significant amounts of power, to be able to make decisions that are meaningful together with other people with whom they sometimes seriously disagree. This is something that I think has got to be retained as a horizon, because I think if you drop this and you embrace a kind of naturalistic view, which argues that only some people are really able to think and everybody else is just kind of fodder for the creative projects of these people, if you adopt a kind of Aristotelian outlook that says that most people are natural slaves, or maybe the most they can be is vulgar craftsmen, and that's just the way it is and the way it's always going to be, that this serves to rationalize an enormous amount of human suffering and underdevelopment that I think doesn't bear scrutiny, or at the very least, we ought to retain some possibility, even if it's just in theory, even if we can't see any immediate way of actualizing it, that this could be overcome and people could actually do stuff. Large numbers of people could do stuff, not just a handful.
So it sounds like you're really drawn to this egalitarian basis of socialism and Marxism, while recognizing that its implicit, those implicit features of it so often don't get realized, don't get implemented in many of the current iterations of Marxism and socialism. But that makes a good deal of sense. And I know that you're a prolific writer, so perhaps you might put that in your memory bank as an invitation to write the Benjamin Studebaker position on socialism. But I do also think that you tend to have an aversion to the sectarian left, which for good reason. And I think our conversation, especially the beginning part of our conversation, indicates why you might have an aversion to it, precisely because so much of it is caught up in a kind of moral problematic that it can't see, right? Can't adequately.
Yeah, I'm interested in stuff that is at least reaching for looking for the political,
Right.
people who are trying to be political in my sense. That's the stuff I really get interested in.
Yeah.
Because whether it succeeds or doesn't succeed, people trying to be political, people searching for the political, that's where, if there is anything that can happen or anything that might emerge over time that can happen, that's what it would look like. It would not look like the sub-political behavior of people who have issues with authority and who are throwing moral injunctions at each other to try to make unrealistic things happen.
Very well said. Well, hey, thank you so much, Benjamin, for your time and for your insights. Is there anything you might want to say to folks about your upcoming work, your existing work, maybe things you want to point people's attention to? Doesn't have to be related to your work. It could be anything. But any final comments?
Well, I want to alert people to one thing, which is that my second book, Legitimacy and Liberal Democracies, which is the book where I talk about the moods,
Yeah.
that book, currently, it's quite expensive, but there is a paperback that is contractually supposed to come out before the end of the year, I think even before the end of November of this year, that will be significantly cheaper than what you can currently find. And I've always had this problem of I write academic books and academic publishers charge too much for my work. It's a problem I'm continuously trying to work on and work through.
Yeah.
But one of the things that will happen is that this paperback will become more affordable than the current hardcover is. So
Very
I would
exciting.
encourage people to pay attention to that when it comes out if they want to read that book.
Well, we'll have you back on to maybe dig deeper into the legitimacy text, which I haven't fully finished, admittedly, but I'm excited to finish it. And I felt maybe this is a good entree to that future conversation. And I think we made a lot of good progress and hit a lot of good points. So thanks to the chat, thanks to our supporters, and as a reminder, please join us on the Patreon. You can join as a free member, but a paying member, of course, always helps sustain my efforts. I think we'll close, comrades and friends. And thank you, Benjamin. Would love to have you back on.
Thank you. It was delightful as always.
All the best. Take care, everyone.